Thank you so much for purchasing the plans for this king-size mobile miter saw station, and I think you're really going to have fun with this build. This miter saw station is really cool because I've built it in a way where it will fit almost all of the popular larger miter saws. It has foldable wings extending about 3.5 feet on each side of the blade. I've incorporated T-Track into those wings so you can use a stop block for repeatable cuts. And I use self-adhesive measuring tape so those cuts can be the perfect distance every time. This has tons of storage with 2 upper drawers and 2 lower areas, one of which is specifically designed to hold a shop vac. You can connect the shop vac hose to your miter saw and your lungs will thank you. Okay, a couple things before we get started. I have measured a lot of the really popular larger miter saws, and this miter saw station is built to fit all of them, even when you rotate the miter saw to the farthest left and right point. With that being said, double check that your specific miter saw will fit in this miter saw station before you start the build. At some points I offer different ways of doing things, so I've just found that the build goes a lot smoother when I watch the video plans first. Even though all the measurements are in the written plans, use referential measurements when building this miter saw station. All that means is don't just go by the measurements in the plans, measure the openings first before you cut the pieces. For example, when cutting the doors to their final dimensions, don't just go by the measurements I have in the plans, measure the opening that the door will fit into so that your door can fit your miter saw station perfectly in case your cabinet is ever so slightly different than mine. Also, measure the bottom right opening that I've designed to fit a shop vac to make sure it will fit your shop vac. I've designed it to fit most shop vacs, but some really large shop vacs may not fit. Okay, let's get to building. I am cutting the cabinet sides, cabinet top, cabinet bottom, and middle shelf to their final dimensions using the table saw and then a track saw. If you don't have a track saw, that is totally fine. A circular saw will get the job done. I just use a track saw because it's a little quicker to set up and it leaves a slightly cleaner cut. Although I'm not going to use the circular saw to actually cut the wood, I do want to show you here how to use a straight edge and a circular saw to finish these pieces. I'm putting both cabinet sides together here so that when I cut both of them at the same time, they will be the exact same lengths. I'm taking my regular single blade out of my table saw and I'm putting in a dado stack because I'm going to be cutting a bunch of dados and rabbets in these pieces. Okay, a couple of tips when cutting dados and rabbets. The first one is always use a scrap piece of plywood to do some test cuts to make sure your dados are the right width and depth. This one was a little too loose for my liking, so I did another test cut and it was a nice snug fit, but you also don't want it to be too tight either. One way to get cleaner cuts is putting some painter's tape on your plywood where your dado stack will be cutting the wood, and it will make your cuts a little cleaner and give you less tear out. I'll show you a side-by-side comparison in a second, and although it's not a massive difference, it does make a difference and will make your project look a little nicer. Okay, this next tip is really important, and I did not take my own advice here, and it made my glue up really stressful when I was gluing up the entire cabinet. I highly recommend that you glue up your entire cabinet, including the upper and lower vertical dividers, in the same day that you cut all your dados and rabbets. What can happen if you wait a couple days is your dados and rabbets can swell, making them slightly narrower. So what once was a good fit, now some of the pieces may not fit very well or at all. So in my case, I actually had to recut some of the dados. So I highly recommend you glue up your pieces, your entire cabinet, on the same day that you cut your rabbets and dados. Here I'm using a sacrificial plywood fence when I cut my rabbet so that my dado stack won't cut my metal rip fence. For these 1/4 inch rabbets, I'm just using my regular single blade and I'm making 2 passes to get that 1/4 inch width. I'm dry fitting all my pieces together so I can see exactly the sizes that my upper and lower vertical dividers need to be. This is another example of using referential measurements. I'm referencing what I've already built to see exactly the sizes that my next pieces need to be. Just in case it wasn't clear in the written plans, every single piece of this project we will be using 3/4 inch plywood, except for the cabinet back and the drawer bottoms we'll be using 1/4 inch plywood. I'm cutting the upper and lower vertical dividers to their final dimensions using a track saw, but you can use the circular saw, and the table saw. I'm sanding the edges of my dados and rabbets so that my pieces can fit a little better, and I'm using tape to help with glue squeeze out when I glue all these pieces together. Using this Titebond to extend was really helpful because it has a longer open time, meaning I have a lot more time to adjust pieces as needed. And my shop is pretty warm these days, so if I were to use regular Titebond 1 or 2, it would set pretty quickly and it would be a lot more stressful to get all these pieces lined up perfectly. This glue up was a little stressful because since I waited a few days after cutting my dados and rabbits to glue everything up, my pieces were fitting a little too tight, but I had enough clamps and everything worked out just fine. I waited about 24 hours for the glue to dry, and then I measured the back of the cabinet to see exactly what dimensions my cabinet back needs to be. I'm using glue and brad nails to secure this 1/4-inch cabinet back to the cabinet, and I don't have a brad nailer, so I'm just hammering in the brad nails like our ancestors did. I'm cutting the risers to their final dimensions, and then I'm securing them to the bottom of the cabinet using wood glue, CA glue, and accelerator. The CA glue and accelerator just acts as a clamp for the wood glue. If I just used wood glue, it would work just fine, but I'd have to hold down each riser for a longer period of time until the wood glue set. I'm cutting the long wing supports and the short wing supports to be a little oversized at this stage. I'm cutting the short wing supports to be their final length of 10 inches, but I'm cutting both the long and short wing supports to be 1.75 inches wide at this stage, which is a 1/4 inch wider. And then I'm cutting the long wing supports to be about a 1/2 inch longer than they need to be, so they're about 24.5 inches long. I'm gluing 2 long wing supports together so they could be about 1.5 inches thick, and I'm doing this 4 times because there are 2 of these per wing. Now that the glue is dry in these long wing supports, I'm cutting about 1/8 of an inch off of each side, taking them down to their final widths of 1.5 inches, giving me a nice clean edge on each side. I'm leaving the fence set to 1.5 inches, and I'm cutting the short wing supports to their final width of 1.5 inches. The first cut on these long wing supports is just giving them a nice clean edge. The second cut on each one will give them a nice clean edge, but also take them down to their final lengths of 24 inches. And I'm using my crosscut sled and a table saw to do this. I'm also using a stop block so that all pieces can be the exact same lengths as each other. I'm using wood glue and clamps to glue these pieces together, and although I'm only showing myself gluing one of these structures together, you will do this 2 times and these will eventually become the foldable wings. I am cutting the wing tops to their final dimensions on the table saw. I'm using glue, trim screws, and clamps to secure the wing tops to the wing bases. I'm cutting a piece of 3/4 inch plywood to about 2.5 inches wide and 22.5 inches long, and I'm securing these to the underside of each wing. This is just meant to give each wing some extra support because I'm going to be cutting a groove in the top of each wing. I'm using a 3/4 inch straight cut bit and my router with a straight edge to make these grooves, but you can use a dado stack in your table saw if you would like. I'm using X-Fasten double-sided tape to secure the straight edge to the top of each wing. Having the straight edge on the right of my router caused my router to drift a little bit, so I would recommend putting this straight edge on the left side of your router, and I made this change eventually and my cuts were much straighter. I made sure the T-track sat just under the top of the wing so it wouldn't interfere with the lumber I'm cutting, and I secured it to my wings using screws. I am cutting the 4 bracket studs to their final dimensions on the table saw, and I'm securing them to the cabinet sides using glue and screws. I'm using my table saw to cut the drawer faces, drawer backs, and drawer sides to their final widths, and they will all be the exact same widths. I'm cutting the drawer faces, which are also called drawer fronts in this case, and the drawer backs to their final lengths on the table saw. Then I'm using a drawer side to mark exactly how wide my rabbets need to be on the drawer fronts and backs. I'm using a stop block as I make the final cut on the first rabbet, and this way I can make sure that all the other rabbets on all the drawer fronts and backs are the exact same widths. You may have noticed the long wing supports drying in the background, and I will admit that I had to do some of the steps in this build out of order. In this case, it was because I wanted to get other parts of the build done while the glue dried in the long wing supports, and I thought it would be more confusing if I kept jumping back and forth between steps in this video. I'm seeing how thick my plywood is when I put both rabbets together, and this will help me see exactly how long I need to cut the drawer sides. I'm cutting my drawer sides to their final lengths, and then I'm cutting dados near the bottom of all these drawer pieces, and these dados will accept the 1/4 inch drawer bottom. I'm just making 2 passes with my regular blade to make these dados, and I'm not putting in a dado stack. Here I'm cutting the drawer bottom to its final dimensions, and then I'm securing the drawer together using wood glue and clamps. I'm measuring the width of the lower left opening so I can see exactly how wide the lower shelf needs to be. I'm drilling 4 pocket holes on each side of this left shelf, and I'm trying to make them evenly spaced. I cut 4 spacers off camera and it'll make installing the shelf much easier. I know it's really tough to see here, but I am securing this shelf in place using pocket hole screws, and I flipped this cabinet over for the last few screws because I thought I could get a better camera angle, and it wasn't great, but it was a little bit better. Here I'm cutting the left and right door to their final dimensions. I like an 1/8 of an inch reveal on my doors, so I cut them accordingly. But if you like a different size reveal, then you may need to cut your doors to a different size. When installing the door hinges, make sure you go by the measurements I put in the written plans, and those measurements are specifically for the brand of hinges that I've put in the written plans. If you buy different hinges, your measurements may be slightly different. All right, let's see how these doors fit. Hey, looks pretty good. Nice. All right, what's behind door number 2? 1, 2. It's not bad either. Nice 1/8 inch reveal all the way around. That actually looks pretty good. I'll let it go all the way. Nice. Good. When you're getting ready to install the folding bracket hardware on the underside of each wing, make sure you pull back each folding bracket about a 1/16 of an inch, as I'm doing here, and that will ensure when you go to install the wings on the cabinet, your wing will not interfere with the bracket studs. Okay, we are almost done with this build. We're in the home stretch. I'm now securing my miter saw to my miter saw station using 4 screws and washers. Then I'm clamping a piece of plywood to my miter saw table because it's the flattest piece of wood I have in my shop. Next, I'm clamping my completed wing to the bracket studs on my cabinet side so that the top of the wing is flush with the plywood I just clamped to my miter saw table. This would be a lot easier with 2 people, but it was doable with just myself. And this is how you ensure that your wings are perfectly aligned with your miter saw table, no matter what miter saw you have. I know this might be a little slow to watch, but I thought it was really important that I didn't speed this up or edit it in any way so you could see exactly how I attach these wings to my cabinet, because I think this is the most important part of the whole build. Then I'm just securing the wings to the cabinet using screws and washers. I'm putting on some self-adhesive measuring tape on the left wing, which will help me when I need to cut pieces to certain specific lengths. And I'm only putting it on the left wing because that's the side I use most often when measuring lumber. I'm putting the cabinet door stops on the cabinet, and then I'm putting on those little metal pieces on the top of each door. And then I'm securing the handles to the drawers and doors. I'm using a 4-inch hole saw to cut a hole in the back, which is where the shop vac hose will come out of. And then I'm using a Forstner bit to drill another hole into the cabinet back, which is where the cord will come out of. I'm drilling holes in the back of my miter saw station just for air ventilation, and I'm drilling them only in the roughly 12-inch by 7-inch section where air will be coming out of my shop vac. Depending on what shop vac you will be using, you may want to drill more holes. I'm using white oak to make the stop block because I had an extra piece lying around, but you can definitely use plywood. It's all personal preference and doesn't really matter. I got a dust chute from Travis at Shop Nation for my miter saw, and he makes dust chutes for a bunch of different miter saws, and it really helps with dust collection. I'll put a link to his store in the description of this video, and I highly recommend that you check it out. You did it! Congratulations on finishing the king-size mobile miter saw station. I think you're going to love all the features this build has to offer, especially the dust collection. Thank you so much for purchasing these plans, and remember, be kind, be awesome.